Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
True crime with a dash of the paranormal, the garish, the strange, and the darkly comic. A podcast that's about more than just murder. It's my very own pocket dimension, home to a curated collection of bizarre and compelling stories. The unsolved, the unsettling, and the unbelievable. I cover it all, just so long as it's kinda murdery. Hey there, kindas. That's right, I'm thinking about referring to fans of Kinda Murdery as the kindas. What do you think? I think it's kinda good. Let me know if you like it, or if you don't like it. Reach out to me on social media, give me your opinion. As you may know, I am your friendly neighborhood podcaster and the host of this safari of murder mysteries. I am Zevin Odelberg, and I am very pleased that you are here. This is part 4 of Kinda Murdery's investigation into the murder of Betsy Faria. That's right, I said part 4, so if you haven't heard parts 1 through 3 yet, go back and listen to them and then rejoin us. I will save you a seat. I'll even have somebody keep it warm for you. But if you're all caught up and ready, well then, so am I. Let's get down to it. Part 4 of Kinda Murdery's investigation of the murder of Betsy Faria starts now. The first court appearances connected to Betsy's murder pulled the case out of police offices and into public view in a way that nothing else had yet. Reporters crowded hallways outside the courthouse carrying notepads, cameras, and coffee cups, while producers spoke rapidly into phones trying to coordinate live coverage before hearings even started. Betsy's photograph appeared everywhere now, on television monitors, newspaper websites, printed packets reporters carried under their arms while moving through security lines. Russ entered the environment already carrying the weight of the public story building around him. By then, most coverage treated the arrest less like a question and more like the expected result of the investigation. The details repeated publicly focused on the violence of the murder, the alleged marital tension, and investigators believing the scene inside the house pointed towards someone close to Betsy. Inside the courthouse, prosecutors moved through the hallways with case folders tucked under their arms, while detectives stayed nearby answering quiet questions and coordinating paperwork. The atmosphere felt tense but controlled, the way high-profile cases often do before hearings begin, everyone moving quickly while trying not to look rushed. Outside one courtroom, members of Betsy's family stood together speaking quietly while reporters waited nearby, hoping someone might stop long enough to answer questions. Russ's supporters started becoming more visible after the arrest too. Friends from game night remained deeply unsettled by the prosecution theory and continued insisting privately that the timeline investigators were presenting didn't make sense to them. Some attended hearings. Others spoke cautiously with reporters or people around town, repeating the same point over and over. Russ had been with them. That split, the widening gap between the prosecution's certainty and the certainty felt by some of Russ's friends, began creating a second emotional current around the case entirely separate from the official investigation. Not loud enough yet to change the direction of the prosecution, but present. One friend sat inside the courthouse hallway after a hearing, staring at the floor while television coverage replayed portions of the case on a mounted screen nearby. Every few minutes, reporters passed through the corridor carrying cameras and legal pads, while attorneys moved between courtrooms, discussing schedules and motions in low voices. The friend finally looked up at the television while another report described Russ as the primary suspect in Betsy's, quote, violent domestic murder, unquote. He kept watching after the segment ended. Pam Hupp's public role in the case continued growing during that same stretch. Reporters increasingly framed her as Betsy's close friend and confidant, the person who had driven Betsy home from chemotherapy, spent time with her during her final months, and spoken openly about Betsy's fears regarding the marriage. Detectives and prosecutors continued treating her as one of the most emotionally compelling witnesses surrounding the case. Pam appeared calm in public settings connected to the investigation, controlled, sympathetic. She spoke about Betsy naturally enough that investigators and reporters alike kept returning to her for perspective about Betsy's life and emotional state before the murder. At the same time, other people around the case began reacting differently to how central Pam had become in the public narrative. Some family members and friends focused entirely on Betsy and the grief surrounding the murder. Others started quietly questioning why Pam seemed so deeply embedded in nearly every version of the story emerging publicly around the case. Those questions stayed mostly private at first. Brief conversations, small reactions, moments of discomfort people didn't fully know what to do with yet. Behind the scenes, the prosecution team continued preparing aggressively for the case moving forward. But the energy inside those meetings had changed from investigative urgency into strategic planning. Prosecutors focused heavily on how jurors might emotionally interpret the people surrounding the case, not just the evidence itself. They discussed Russ's demeanor, Betsy's illness, Pam's credibility, the emotional tone of witness testimony, and how the story of the marriage would sound in court. That shift mattered because the case itself increasingly depended on narrative coherence as much as physical evidence. Prosecutors believed they understood the emotional structure of the murder now. A sick woman, a deteriorating marriage, growing tension, violence inside the home. One prosecutor spent nearly an hour reorganizing witness lists based less on chronology and more on emotional impact during trial presentation. Across the table, another prosecutor quietly noted that jurors needed to feel like the murder, quote, made sense, unquote, emotionally, before the forensic details would fully land. Nobody in the room challenged the idea. Outside the courthouse, one evening after another hearing, reporters clustered near the sidewalk, waiting for attorneys and investigators to emerge. Camera lights illuminated drifting breath in the cold air while people connected to the case moved carefully through the crowd, trying to avoid questions shouted from behind microphones. Russ's supporters stayed close to him through parts of that period, but the strain had become visible by then. Every new headline increased the pressure. Every hearing deepened the sense that the machinery of the prosecution was already moving forward, regardless of what they believed privately about the timeline or the investigation. As Russ moved toward a waiting vehicle after one hearing, reporters shouted questions about Betsy, about the murder, about whether he maintained his innocence. Cameras followed him all the way to the car door. Across the street, Pam stood speaking quietly with another person connected to the case, while reporters nearby continued focusing almost entirely on Russ. For a brief moment, nobody's attention rested on her at all. Weeks after the arrest, the emotional center of the case had started drifting away from the police investigation itself and toward the people left trying to live inside the aftermath. Betsy's murder was no longer just something being processed in briefing rooms and court filings. It had become part of the daily life for everyone connected to it. Conversations changed when certain names entered the room. Friend groups fractured quietly. Families learned how exhausting it was to have reporters calling repeatedly at all hours, asking for reactions to developments they themselves barely understood yet. For Russ's supporters, the frustration deepened every time another news segment presented the prosecution's theory as settled fact. People who believed in him found themselves speaking more carefully in public because defending Russ increasingly sounded, to outsiders, like defending the murder itself. One evening, several friends gathered around a kitchen table after a hearing. Paperwork and fast food wrappers spread between them while they tried once again to walk through the timeline from game night. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody sounded theatrical. Mostly, they sounded tired. Every version of the evening they remembered still ended in the same place. Russ was with them. The strain of the case also began changing the emotional texture around Betsy herself. Early coverage focused heavily on the violence of her death and the accusations against Russ. But people closest to Betsy increasingly found themselves trying to hold on to ordinary memories that existed before the murder consumed everything else. Chemotherapy appointments, phone calls, small routines, conversations about everyday things that suddenly felt impossibly far away from the arrest. One family member later described the strange disorientation of watching Betsy slowly become transformed in public from a person into a prosecution narrative. Television coverage flattened her life into a handful of repeated images and phrases, while the people who actually knew her continued carrying around much messier, more human memories. Meanwhile, prosecutors kept building forward steadily, preparing witness lists and organizing the emotional sequence of the case they intended to present publicly at trial. Pam Hupp remained unusually close to the center of those preparations. Prosecutors and investigators still viewed her as emotionally compelling and credible, especially because she connected directly to Betsy's final day alive. But outside those official circles, the reactions to Pam had started becoming more uneven. Some people found her sympathetic. Others found something difficult to define in the way she moved through the case publicly. Not suspicious exactly, just present. Constantly present. One person connected to the broader social circle around the case later described feeling uncomfortable watching how naturally Pam inserted herself into conversations involving investigators, reporters, and Betsy's emotional state. Another remembered being surprised by how confidently Pam spoke about details surrounding the marriage and the prosecution theory so early in the process. Those reactions still floated mostly at the level of instinct rather than accusation. But they existed now, and once people noticed discomfort, they rarely stopped noticing it, like worrying a toothache. Inside the defense side of the case, the emotional atmosphere looked very different from the confidence building inside the prosecution. Russ's attorneys inherited not just a murder charge, but a public narrative that already felt emotionally complete to most outsiders. The challenge wasn't simply arguing facts. It was confronting the momentum of a story people already believed they understood. Defense meetings stretched late into evenings while attorneys reviewed timelines, interview summaries, and discovery materials turned over from the prosecutors. The game night timeline remained central because it represented the strongest structural problem inside the prosecution's version of events. But defense attorneys also started paying attention to something else. The emotional architecture of the case itself. Who investigators trusted, who shaped the narrative early, whose voice carried unusual influence over the direction of the prosecution. One attorney reportedly spent a long stretch reviewing interview summaries involving Pam Hupp before setting the file aside separately from the others. Not because it disproved the case, not yet, but because something about it kept pulling attention back toward her. As the case moved closer toward the long road of trial preparation, the emotional certainty surrounding Russ's guilt remained strong publicly, but underneath that certainty smaller fractures had begun appearing, quietly, inconsistently, almost beneath the level of formal notice. Friends who couldn't reconcile the timeline, family members uneasy with how quickly everything solidified, defense attorneys lingering longer over certain witness statements than others, people who couldn't fully explain why parts of the story bothered them. Only that they did. Late one night, after another long defense meeting, a stack of case materials remained spread across a conference table long after everyone else had left the room. Witness statements sat mixed together beside call logs, photographs, and interview summaries under dim overhead lighting. One folder remained slightly separated from the rest. Pam Hupp. Defense attorneys spent increasing amounts of time pulling apart the emotional assumptions underneath the prosecution's version of events, rather than focusing only on the physical evidence. The prosecution had a story jurors could immediately understand. That was obvious. A husband, a dying wife, violence inside the home. But the defense kept returning to the timeline because it refused to sit comfortably no matter how many times they reconstructed it. One late evening, several defense materials remained spread across a conference table while attorneys worked through the night reviewing phone logs and interview summaries again. Coffee cups sat untouched beside legal pads crowded with handwritten notes and circled timestamps. Nobody in the room sounded certain yet, but they no longer sounded convinced the prosecution's theory fit cleanly either. Russ himself had started changing under the pressure of the case by then. The shock surrounding Betsy's death had gradually fused with the exhaustion of being treated publicly as her killer. Court hearings, media coverage, attorney meetings, repeated discussions about the investigation. It all compressed together until ordinary life almost disappeared underneath the machinery of the prosecution. People close to Russ noticed it in small ways first. Long silences, fatigue, the way he drifted during conversations. The strain of constantly reliving the same night whenever attorneys or investigators revisited details connected to Betsy's murder. At the same time, some of the people supporting him became more forceful privately in questioning the prosecution's assumptions. The game night timeline still bothered them. The certainty bothered them. The speed with which the investigation had emotionally organized itself around Russ bothered them. One supporter later described the feeling that the case had started making emotional sense to investigators before all the facts fully did, and that distinction stayed lodged in people's minds. Pam Hupp, meanwhile, continued moving through the case with an ease that some people increasingly found difficult to ignore. She remained deeply woven into both the prosecution's narrative and the public understanding of Betsy's final months. Detectives trusted her. Prosecutors viewed her as emotionally credible. Reporters returned to her repeatedly because she spoke confidently and seemed close to the emotional center of the story. But the more visible Pam became, the more certain people around the case began reacting to her differently, not because they believed she was capable of murder. Their discomfort came from something harder to define. How naturally she occupied space around the investigation, how frequently she inserted herself into conversations surrounding Betsy and Russ, how quickly she seemed to understand the emotional direction of the prosecution. One defense team discussion reportedly lingered on Pam far longer than expected after attorneys began comparing her statements against timelines and interview summaries from other witnesses. No dramatic revelation emerged from that conversation. Just attention, sustained attention. And once attention fixes somewhere inside a murder case, it tends to stay there. The prosecution remained outwardly confident through all of this. Court filings continued. Witness preparation moved forward. Investigators and prosecutors still believed they had correctly identified the person responsible for Betsy's death, and most public coverage reinforced that belief rather than challenging it. But privately, the case had become more complicated than it first appeared. Not weaker exactly, just more unstable. Defense attorneys pushed harder on timing issues surrounding game night. Certain witness statements created friction when placed side by side instead of viewed individually. Prosecutors still believed the emotional logic of the murder pointed toward Russ, but the defense increasingly focused on the difference between emotional plausibility and factual certainty. The distinction slowly became one of the fault lines running underneath the case itself. One prosecutor spent an evening reviewing defense filings while crime scene photographs remained spread across a nearby table. The room stayed quiet except for pages turning and the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Eventually, the prosecutor pushed the photographs aside and returned to the timeline instead. By the end of that stretch, the case surrounding Betsy's murder no longer felt like a straight line moving cleanly toward conviction. Publicly, the prosecution still held the narrative advantage. Most people following the case continued viewing Russ as the obvious suspect. But underneath the official story, pressure had started building in less visible ways. Questions lingered longer. Certain details refused to settle neatly. Pam Hupp's growing presence inside the case kept attracting quiet attention from people examining the story close enough. Late one night after another long defense meeting, attorneys slowly gathered papers from the conference table while leaving several files behind to revisit the next morning. Most of the room emptied out except for one attorney still sitting beneath the dim overhead lights flipping through witness interviews in silence. After several minutes, he reached for the same file again. Pam Hupp. He opened it back up and started rereading from the beginning. He leaned back slightly in the chair without taking his eyes off the paperwork. Several pages from Pam's interviews remained spread beside phone logs and portions of the timeline connected to Betsy's final day alive. The attorney reached for a pen, underlined part of the statement once, then circled a section farther down the page before looking back toward the wall where portions of the prosecution's timeline still remained written from earlier strategy discussions. The problem wasn't that Pam's statements obviously contradicted the case. It was something subtler, the emotional precision of them. The way her descriptions seemed to naturally reinforce nearly every emotional conclusion investigators already wanted to believe about Russ and the marriage. The attorney flipped back through another interview transcript involving Betsy's friends and family, comparing tone, wording, and specificity. Most people described Betsy in fragments. Memories, impressions, conversations recalled imperfectly. Pam's statements felt unusually shaped, focused, narratively clean. That realization sat heavily in the room once it arrived. Not proof, not even suspicion yet, just discomfort that was becoming harder to ignore. The following morning, portions of that discomfort started surfacing more openly inside the defense team. Attorneys gathered again around the same conference table while hearing schedules and trial preparation materials sat pushed partly aside to make room for witness files and interview summaries. Pam's statements now occupied the center of the discussion instead of the edge. One attorney walked slowly through the sequence again. Pam driving Betsy home. Pam discussing Betsy's fears. Pam describing tension involving money. Pam becoming one of the emotional foundations of the prosecution's theory of the case. The room stayed quiet while people reviewed the material independently. One defense investigator finally pointed out how much of the emotional architecture surrounding the prosecution's case rested not on forensic evidence, but on Pam's interpretation of Betsy's emotional state. That shifted the conversation immediately. Because if Pam's framing became less reliable, large portions of the prosecution narrative became less emotionally stable too, not destroyed, but destabilized. Across the table, another attorney began writing a fresh set of notes beside Pam's name. Outside the defense office, the public case against Russ still moved forward with momentum. Reporters continued covering hearings and repeating the prosecution's version of events. Most people following the case still viewed Pam sympathetically and Russ suspiciously. Nothing publicly had shifted yet, but privately, attention had begun turning. Defense investigators started pulling more material connected to Pam, financial information, background details, prior statements, timelines independent of the prosecution's summaries. Not because they believed they had uncovered the real killer, but because the deeper they looked into the case, the harder it became to separate Pam from the emotional structure holding the prosecution's theory together. One investigator spent part of the afternoon reconstructing Pam's movements on the day Betsy died, while another reviewed earlier interview notes from detectives who initially spoke with her after the murder. The room carried the nervous energy of people beginning to realize that the case might be more complicated than they first thought. Late that evening, after most of the office had gone quiet again, the defense team gathered around the conference table one more time before heading home. Trial materials remained spread everywhere, motions, witness lists, and hearing notes, but the focus of the conversation had shifted almost entirely toward Pam. Not aggressively, carefully, cautiously. Nobody in the room wanted to overreach or chase conspiracy where none existed. The prosecution's case against Russ still carried enormous weight publicly. Betsy was dead. Russ had been charged. Detectives remained confident. But the defense no longer viewed Pam as background. One attorney finally looked around the table and said what everybody else had already started thinking privately. If she's wrong about Russ, then this whole thing changes. Nobody answered immediately after that. Outside, rain tapped softly against the office windows while the room fell silent around Pam Hupp's open file sitting at the center of the table. The shift inside the defense team changed the emotional gravity of the case almost immediately. Pam Hupp had spent months existing inside the prosecution narrative as supporting structure, important, sympathetic, emotionally persuasive, but ultimately secondary to the central accusation against Russ. Now, for the first time, the defense attorneys had started examining her as a person whose statements might need to withstand scrutiny themselves. That subtle difference altered the room. Defense attorneys no longer viewed Pam's interviews simply to understand the prosecution theory. They started reading them the way investigators read statements from anyone close to a homicide, looking for inconsistencies, patterns, omissions, moments where emotion sounded overly directed instead of naturally recalled. One investigator sat beneath the harsh office lighting with several versions of Pam's statements spread side by side, comparing the phrasing across interviews conducted days apart. A yellow legal pad beside him had filled with small handwritten notes and question marks. Certain themes appeared repeatedly: fear, money, Russ's temper. The attorney studying the pages finally leaned back and quietly asked whether Pam ever talked about anything that didn't reinforce the prosecution's theory. Nobody answered immediately. At the same time, Russ's supporters began reacting strongly to the defense team's growing interest in Pam. For weeks, most conversations around the case had centered almost entirely on the prosecution timeline and the weaknesses supporters believed existed inside it. But now, for the first time, the people close to Russ started reconsidering earlier interactions with Pam through a different lens. Not accusing, reassessing. Old conversations suddenly felt different when replayed mentally after hearing how central Pam had become to the prosecution's narrative. One supporter spent an evening flipping through old notes from court hearings and media coverage, while another sat nearby recalling conversations involving Pam after Betsy's death. Small details people barely noticed earlier now lingered longer once revisited. How quickly Pam had aligned herself with investigators. How confidently she spoke about Betsy's fears. How present she remained around the emotional center of the case. The discussion stayed careful because nobody wanted to sound irrational or desperate. Russ still faced murder charges. The prosecution still held enormous momentum publicly, but uncertainty had started moving in a different direction now. Defense investigators also began looking more closely at Pam's personal history outside the immediate murder timeline. The process unfolded quietly at first. Background records, financial documents, timelines unrelated to Betsy's death itself. The defense team approached it cautiously because they understood how dangerous it could be to force an alternate theory too early without evidence strong enough to support it. Still, curiosity kept deepening. One investigator spent hours assembling a broader timeline involving Pam's relationship with Betsy, her role during Betsy's illness, and her growing proximity to both investigators and prosecutors after the murder. Another reviewed interviews again while isolating portions where Pam described Betsy emotionally rather than factually. The difference between those two kinds of statements had started mattering more to the defense. Facts could be checked. Emotional framing shaped perception. And Pam had become extraordinarily influential in shaping how investigators understood the marriage between Betsy and Russ. Late one afternoon, an attorney quietly remarked that Pam seemed less like a witness orbiting the case, and more like somebody helping to narrate it. Meanwhile, the prosecution continued moving forward confidently in public. Court hearings proceeded. Reporters repeated the same broad outline of the case. Betsy's murder still appeared to most outsiders emotionally straightforward. A husband accused of killing his terminally ill wife inside their home remained a narrative many people accepted instinctively without needing much additional explanation. The public certainty frustrated Russ's supporters even more as time passed. Some avoided media coverage altogether because hearing the case reduced repeatedly to simplified emotional framing became unbearable after a while. Others consumed every hearing update obsessively, searching for signs the defense might eventually break through the prosecution's version publicly. Inside defense meetings, attorneys increasingly discussed not just evidence but perception itself, how jurors absorb emotional narratives, how sympathy shapes assumptions, how witnesses can become powerful not simply because they provide facts, but because they provide coherence. And nobody inside the case provided coherence more effectively than Pam Hupp. That realization had started making everyone in the defense office deeply uneasy. Late one night, long after most lights inside the office had gone dark, Two members of the defense team remained seated across from each other, reviewing material connected to Pam. The rest of the case had temporarily faded into stacks around the edges of the room, while her interviews, timelines, and background materials occupied the center of the table beneath a single overhead light. Rain tapped softly against the windows outside. One investigator flipped slowly through a transcript before stopping at a passage and sliding the pages across the table without speaking. The attorney opposite him read silently for nearly a full minute. Then he looked back up. "What if," he said carefully, "what if we're looking at the wrong relationship in this case?" The silence stretched for several minutes before the other investigator finally spoke. "Everybody treated her like part of the scenery." Outside the window, rain drifted softly through the parking lot lights. Inside, the investigator turned another page in Pam Hupp's file and quietly said, "I'm starting to think she wanted it that way." All right, we're going to stop there. Please do join me next week, Wednesday, May 27th, for Part 5 of Kinda Murdery's investigation of the murder of Betsy Faria. And hey, between now and then, if you know anybody who likes a true crime podcast, family, friends, somebody you bump into in the grocery store, a random stranger that you scream at out of your car window when you drive through the intersection. Maybe don't do that, but if you do, go ahead and tell them about Kinda Murdery. I sure would appreciate it. Hey, and also reach out to me on social media and tell me what you guys think about being called Kindas, because I'm kinda into it. Once again, I really appreciate you being here. I'm Zevin Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery.
If you like the show, please subscribe, review, and tell your friends. You can find us on social media at Kinda Murdery or email at kindamurdery@gmail.com.